NTV.
Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Let's delve into our very first conversation of the day. Uganda has the world's youngest population with over 78% of the population below the age of 30. Did you believe that? Well, it is true. Now, with just under 8 million youth aged 15 to 30, the country also has one of the highest youth unemployment rates in sub-Saharan Africa. But is the country planning for this majority in its budgeting process? To speak to us, I do have Mr. Alan Muhereza. He is the team leader at Youth for Tax Justice Network, and he joins me right now in studio. Very good morning, Mr. Alan.
Good morning, and good morning to our viewers.
Now, first things first, is the country planning for the majority of the young people in this country, who make 78% of those people living under the age of 30?
I wouldn't say it is, because when you say you're planning, that should be reflected in the priorities where you're putting the money.
Yeah.
And if you look at key priority sectors for young people, you have quality education, you have ICT and innovation, you have agriculture that is supporting most of the young people, and you also have trade and industry, where you have most young people being entrepreneurs and trying to do self-employment. So if we look at our budget, for example, do those four areas really come at the top of? Do they? Of course they don't. That's what I'm saying, that when we're looking at priorities, like some popular musician says, take a cent or your heart is where your money is. So if we're looking at our budget and the key priority areas, you have transport and works, you have security, you have debt repayment. Even when you have education, the money in education is not really going to development or enhancing the education sector. It is mainly going to recurrent expenditure. So I don't think that reflects the priorities that we're talking about, especially when it comes to young people, because when you say you want to plan for young people in a digital era and in this industrial age, you have to look at things like ICT and innovation. When we've had COVID, and in almost every other country, you've had people innovating tests, you've had people innovating contact tracing, you have people innovating in all these other areas, but we've been lagging behind because we've not been putting money in some of these sectors, ICT and innovation. We've not been putting enough money in sectors like agriculture. The president recently was saying that agriculture is a core, is part of the core economy. Indeed. And it employs most of our young people. But if you're employing 60% of the population, that should be able to reflect in our lives as young people. It should be able to reflect in our sort of incomes, but even in the tax base, because when I'm earning, I'm supposed to pay some of the taxes. So if agriculture as a sector should also be reflecting, let me say, in the taxes that make Uganda money, it's not. And again, when you look at the basics, when you talk about, for example, what are the youth in agriculture, for example, doing? Are they the ones that are doing the dairy that is producing the 2.6 billion liters that the president is talking about? Of course not. They are doing normal subsistence farming. They are doing things that are to help them survive. So when we talk about priorities and planning for this country, I think we're supposed to be talking about putting more money where we are finding that this will be helpful to young people. And that brings me to the other sector. We've talked about agriculture, we've talked about ICT, but also there is trade and industry. If you look at the budget of trade and industry, yes. And yet we know that also Uganda not only has the biggest number of young people, but it also has the biggest number of people that create their sort of employment, entrepreneurs, people that come up to start businesses, to start doing some of self-employment, what we call entrepreneurs. And it has been helpful to government. They've been trying to set up businesses to employ other young people. But when you look at the budget priorities, where is trade and industries? Because you could say there is youth livelihood fund, but have we had an assessment of that fund to say that this has really developed youth entrepreneurship? So are we planning for young people? And I don't think it's reflecting in our budget priorities, because if you look at them, you just have works and transport, you have debt repayment, something that has even taken away more money from these other key sectors, and then it's affecting us. And when you look at, when we don't feed the cow, we go back, we can't get taxes from these sectors, then we go back and borrow more, and then, so it's like a vicious cycle. You borrow, then you pay more in debt repayment. Money you would have been putting in, for example, trade and industry. Right now, almost the entire informal sector had been closed down for 3 months. So the question is, where are these young startups going to get money? Startups that may not even be registered, startups that may not even have the key basics of, but they've been there, they've been doing some work, they've been employing a person or two. So how are we going to deal with that kind of industry, to have some sort of access to credit finance that is not linked to these youth livelihood things that we've been talking about, because they've failed, they've not really worked. So I think we are not really doing the planning that.
When it comes to the issue of startups, I understand that the government, through the president himself, during the State of the Nation address, he did mention that he's going to bankroll the Uganda Industry and Research Institute so that they can focus on the incubation of these business startups. And also on the issue of agriculture, he said that they would actually inject some 300 billion into agriculture. Do you think these measures would go a long way in including the young people in development strategies? Yes.
Well, until they happen, they are just still that. Until we see that man actually in these banks, because that, I think the entire National Development Plan 2 was on that idea, and it ended. We are starting a National Development Plan 3, and we've still not seen that. So until actually that actually happens, then those are still good plans. But again, like I said, usually you look back at what has been happening and you get to sort of know what is going to happen in the future. If we are saying that we are going to put in research and what, but we have universities. Have we been putting research in these universities?
Indeed.
When we have we been putting money for research in these universities? Because when you look at my career, I think exactly. So, and this is where raw information, raw innovations come from. Besides, before you even go to commercializing some of these innovations. So, at this point, I think it's still rhetoric. But we will still wait and see what happens. But I think right now what young people really want is not really waiting for development, Uganda Development Bank or National Development Corporation. No, we need simple solutions, system, and there are systems that can actually deliver some of these solutions. And like I was saying, not all these young people, for example, are running startups that are registered, but they are there. Not all of them are doing work that is being captured within the what you would call the formal economy, but they are there. So as we wait for the government to fund National Development Bank or to fund National Development Corporation, there are things that actually it can do now.
What can they do now?
Of course, first and foremost, they have to make it easier for young people to innovate and to communicate. That is the first thing, because there is research recently that came out that, for example, use of mobile money in businesses has helped women businesses grow, but we still have taxes on mobile money transactions, the withdrawals. We've seen that we need, for example, access, like I said, access to finance. Right now, for example, from this part of COVID, and there is a sort of pilot that you said is trying out, where they're sending people 100,000. It may seem little, but it can help someone to just go back to doing business. I'll give an example. Right now, there are people that were entirely depending on boda to travel, and they can no longer do that. But they have to pay certain bills. They have to, and that is the person that was supposed to be a passenger. But there is also the boda driver. There is also the mechanic, the person that is cooking his food, the person that is. So they can start with a sort of disbursement, and the money, because they've borrowed a lot of money in the name of COVID and in the name of rescuing people, they can start with giving some people some little money. Of course, that is subject to very many issues of abuse and corruption and bureaucracies, but that can be a start, because when we're talking about the trickle-down economics has not really worked anywhere, where we say let's put money in banks and let people access it and start start businesses. We've not seen it work. It should have worked with National Youth Livelihood Fund. It didn't work. So the idea is that we should make it easier for people to receive this money. If we have almost mobile money is at 82% penetration. I have an account, you have an account. You could be able to reach people at that point, and even follow it up because we have our phones registered. So they could start there, but also they could waive some of these fees that are that are hard for young people to engage. That the process of and the fees that you pay when you, let me say, you're trying to formalize or you're trying to start up somewhere. For now, they should waive those. They should say if you've been doing ABCD and probably the only thing you did have is a license, tomorrow come to KCC and get a license. And that will help, because if I've been needing a license to get a loan, that becomes automatically an easy thing for me to do. If they've been saying that you need, let me say, it's usually the license, things like TIN numbers. You can get the TIN, but you say, okay, if I'm expected to pay, let me not pay maybe for the next 3 months when it comes maybe to withholding, VAT, those things, so that at that moment you have some sort of liquidity as a startup. And then after that, we can now reassess and see how we recover from that. So I'm not a believer in trickle-down economics. I'm not really hopeful that we are going to put money in Uganda Development Bank and it will reach me as Alan. It is not likely. If the money that was at the district didn't reach me, so I think there's other ways we could do this.
I see your point. So where does that leave the young people in that case?
Of course, the young people have options. One, first we have to demand to be part of the decision-making process.
That is the main point. How do you demand?
Exactly. Yes. You see, because, for example, even like this year, the budget process was so opaque that usually you have people present to these committees because of COVID and all that. People are not supposed to present. But in the past, we've had young people have positions when it comes to the budget committees of Parliament, when it comes to the finance committees of Parliament. We should do more of that, not even just at the national level, but also at the local government level, because once we are not there when these decisions are being made, we cannot really do anything after that. We just have to wait for that. So that's the first point, that we have to be part of that decision-making process, and we have to be listened to, because some of
the young people themselves.
Yes. And I'm saying it is possible because in the past we've been doing it. We just have to do more of it these days, because again, when we look at, for example, every district in this country has youth councillors. When you look at the budgeting, when we have the national budgeting conferences at local government level, are we having young voices at that point to bring out some of these issues? But then also, young people have to actively participate in political processes. The reason as why I'm saying actively, because some have been participating probably passively, but we've realized that when it comes to issues of domestic resource mobilization, when someone is deciding which tax I'm going to put and which tax I'm not going to put, when someone is deciding which sectors of the economies are key or are priority, when someone is deciding most of these very critical decisions, these are political decisions.
Alan, many people believe that the youth would want to engage in the politics of this country, but it's the measures that were put in place by the government that make it hard for the youth to engage. Say the OTT tax on social media. You had so many activists in 2016 coming out to speak on some of the rife social injustices that were taking center stage, 2015, 2016. Then when you had OTT, that number went down drastically. So does government have something to do with this? The low numbers we are seeing of young people getting engaged in politics.
Of course, in a political system, they would, in any political system, the incumbents would like to maintain the status quo. I don't think anyone would willingly cede space or power to anyone. But engagement should be continuous and it should be progressive. I think, like we said, people are engaged. Now should be the time for those engagements to go back and ask these people that a year or two ago we said we didn't want a tax, you passed it. Why should we entrust you to be our representative that we can come to you, give you our views, and you disregard them? So it should be a continuous process, and because they engage at that point, they can now hold these leaders accountable now. You understand? So whereas it may take a little bit longer, but it eventually, when you've consciously been building the capacities, it will. So now is the time, for example, to ask our MPs, because we know according to our constitution, we should be having elections at least by February. We should be asking them, if we told you we didn't want OTT, you went on and passed it, why should we entrust you with that same responsibilities again? And we should also be able to come out and say we are alternatives to that, to whatever is going on. So we need active participation in these political processes. And it could start from the youth councils, like I've been saying. It could start from the local government level, because a lot of implementation is done at local government. It could start with our members of parliament, because at the end of the day, if we've been engaging and they've not been listening, this is the time to make them accountable. And we usually have that chance once in every 5 years. So that is the other thing, that they should actively participate in political processes. But the other thing is that where we can, let us also engage and help government to actualize some of these issues. For example, most of the times when we started this conversation by saying allocations, budget allocations here and there, but the other part of the conversation usually doesn't come out. Where is this money going to come from? When you're talking about having more money in ICT, where is it going to come from? Are we going to borrow more? Are we going to tax people more? Are we going to sell our oil and
tax people more?
No, I'm saying we should be having these conversations as young people, because they are very important conversations. And the example I usually give is that, for example, why should a 40-year-old, why should a 78-year-old borrow money for a country to be paid back in 40 years? This 70-year-old person is not going to be around in 40 years. So why should he be making so we need realistic projections. Exactly. Now, and I'm saying, as young people, we should be interested in these conversations, especially when you look at, for example, debt. That's what I'm saying, that you're 78 years, you're borrowing money to be paid in 40 years. In 40 years, you're not going to be around.
Before we get into date, I don't want to veer away from the main subject matter, which is the budgeting process for the majority of the young people who are 30 and below. So let's talk about the budgeting process and the ramifications that would arise out of this neglect we are seeing, or the low prioritization of young people when it comes to the budgeting process. What would be the immediate ramifications from such?
Of course, the first thing is that we have very, very low productivity as a country. That every time we say we need to produce, that is not translating into the production. Why? Because we've not put money where it's supposed to be put, and that usually clearly comes up. It has also come up when it comes to issues of unemployment, which also has other connotations, poverty, conflict, stroke crime, and so when we don't really when we don't really budget for young people, we will find that we now take measures that will either push them out of work, that will either they don't really push them out of work, but even when they get, for example, the education that the current budget is paying for, it doesn't surmount very much out there in the economy. So when we neglect some of these issues, those are some of the challenges we get. But also there had been a very a narrative that Africa was rising, that we have a young population, and therefore if we invested in quality education and quality health care, we are supposed to be getting a demographic dividend, and then the population is supposed to propel us to more economic prosperity. But that hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened because we've not gotten the quality education. We've not invested in quality health care. So it means that there would be young, big productive population is not really producing.
Even the young people being produced from these education institutions are not at par with the skills that the industry needs to continue and develop.
And that is what I was saying.
I see your point. But then let's talk about the recommendations of Youth for Tax Justice Network. What would be your recommendations for government to employ in this interim so that they can be able to involve the youth more in the budgeting process?
First and foremost, I would recommend that government keeps the structured engagements that we've been having with them, especially when it comes to public hearings of the committees in Parliament. We've in the past had engagements with the Ministry of Finance, the Tax Policy Department, on youth engagements when it comes to which sectors do we tax and which sectors don't we tax when it comes to empowering young people. And so those structured conversations should remain. Those structured ways should remain. But also, right now, government should also we should prioritize. Every time we see supplementary budgets coming in Parliament, they say this is urgent, let's work on this. I think even though the budget was passed already, we should go back because of the circumstances that we're in and listen to each other, especially as young people, and say these are key priority areas for young people. We are in an industrial age, for example, in the information age. We need money in these key sectors.
Indeed.
We need money in trade and ICT, in trade and investment. We have, as government, should be able to and willing to reopen this conversation because they can. And like I've said, if they want to get a supplementary budget for something, they will get it. If they want to engage at any time, they can engage. So I'm saying, whereas the budgeting process for this financial year may have come to a close because the budget has already passed, we can still have this conversation. We can still reopen up for some of these, especially in the background of COVID-19, that these were our expectations, but as young people, we think that we will need more help when it comes to our startups and entrepreneurs. We will need more help when it comes to our fellow people in the service industry, the border, because I know people think it as a problem, but border is the second biggest employer after agriculture for young people.
Over 1 million in there.
Exactly. So we need to have conversations about. So the recommendation is that government should reopen this process, that we should re-engage. The engagement should be continuous, not to say that we shall deal with that in the next financial year. So a certain business may not survive the next 3 months. And then lastly, from Youth for Tax Justice Network, we should re-examine the the domestic resource mobilization processes when it comes to, as young people, how are we getting the money we need as a government to pay for some of these ambitious things we're asking for. And for, we should have that conversation. Should we be borrowing more? And we want to have this conversation with government, that for us as young people, we don't think borrowing more is the way to go.
In a nutshell, you're telling me, Alan Mujeres, that the government has the capacity to get the money they need to help the young people, but they do not have the will to go ahead with it.
They don't. I don't think they
Alan Mujeres, the team leader at Youth for Tax Justice Uganda, thank you very much for having made the time to speak to us.
Thank you very
Very
much.
insightful. At this point in time, I'd like to head over to my reporter, Stephen Mbide, once again, who is now standing by at the Link bus terminal to give you a feel of what is happening there. A situational analysis. Back to you again, Mr. Mbide.